Hi friends, welcome to the Bible Project Daily Podcast. And today we launch off on our new season, Season 15, working through the book of Deuteronomy. Today is just a short introductory episode where I'll be giving you an overview of the book before launching off on some main studies together. Thank you for being with me. I hope you found the bonus episodes I posted in the interim whilst preparing for this series in Deuteronomy. I hope you find them interesting and enlightening. And maybe if you're interested in that sort of material that I've done during the bonus episode, Patreon's the place where you'll find I do that. Patreon's the place where I'm trying to build a community of people who want a deeper insight into not just the main Bible studies that I do online, the Bible Project Daily Podcast and my monthly History of the Church podcast, but also all the stuff I'm doing regularly in the secular world, my preaching in local churches if it's recorded, and I also put on there either my preparation or reworkings of talks I've given in secular environments. I regularly attend a philosophical society. I also attend a psychology study group where we come together and discuss a classic book of psychology. And sometimes if we have a volunteer each week to actually lead that discussion and do a presentation on the work. And sometimes, about once every 2 or 3 months, I get the opportunity to present my view or analysis of these texts from a Christian perspective. So all that sort of stuff I'm doing in the rest of my life, I post over there as 3 bonus episodes, exclusively Patreon members. And then later on they appear sometimes in the interim phases between the main seasons of the Bible Project Daily Podcast. Now you can follow me on Patreon for free. You don't have to subscribe to one of the subscription tiers, although those tiers are the way in which people who want to can support this ministry and enable this ministry to be free across all the world and all the major podcast platforms. This is now my main call to ministry and my only source of regular income. So I'm really grateful for those who do it. But please note, you do not have to subscribe to a subscription level. There's just an opportunity to do that if you want. But all the extra resources I'm putting on Patreon, pretty much all of them are available for free or made free very soon. But the main thing is just to say thank you to all those people around the world who are accessing this podcast and my other History of the Church podcast because they're finding it helpful. It blesses me to know that there are so many people around the world, well over 190 countries, listening to this podcast every day. So thank you to them, which of course means thank you to you. Now today I'm just going to do a short 10 or 15 minute introduction to this book of Deuteronomy that we're going to cover. I think it's helpful when studying any book of the Bible to have a little bit of an understanding about who the author is and very importantly who the recipients were that the book was being written to. That enables us to put a context and interpretation across the whole book. Also, of course, we need to have an insight into what the key message the author is trying to get apart. And that's what I'm going to do today. I'm going to try and look at those main issues. Who the author was, who the recipients were of this message, and what that message was. And I'll also at the end give you a little bit of a breakdown of the structure of the book. And from that, I hope we can get an insight into the purpose, the reason Moses wrote this book, what he wants us to get out of it. So that's the plan today. It should only take about 10 minutes from here, and then we launch off tomorrow, covering the first chapter of this book and thinking about the incredible faithfulness of God to those who are obedient to God. Thanks for being with me today. Okay, welcome to the book of Deuteronomy. The subtitle I've given this book is the Book of the Obedience of God. Now, the title of this book, Deuteronomy, actually means technically second law, and that title comes from the name given to it when the Septuagint was created. That was the Greek version of the Hebrew Bible, the Hebrew Old Testament Bible, that was written around about 300 years before Christ appeared. The title, however, Deuteronomy, Second Law, is slightly misleading because in effect it doesn't actually contain a second law. It is in fact the reinstatement and the explanation of the law previously given to Moses and thereby to the people. It's identified therefore as a book of remembrance and retrospect, reminding people of the law that had been given by God to his people, but a book which shows that new hope could be obtained through the spiritual experience of aligning their life with obedience to that original law. Now, the book itself, in the text, indicates that it was Moses who wrote it. Deuteronomy chapter 31 verse 9 tells us so. Now, there are also various first-hand references to Moses' experience that we see throughout the text as we'll work through it. We'll hear Moses talk about what happens in chapter 5, chapter 9, and chapter 25. But it's also worth noting that other books of the Old Testament also attribute the book to Moses himself. And of course, we can't forget that Jesus himself indicated that Moses was the author. That, for me, of course, is the most compelling piece of evidence that Moses wrote this book. Jesus himself declared so in Matthew chapter 19, verse 8. And then you also have the fact that church tradition, rolling on from the early apostolic church leaders and the church fathers, that they all passed on that belief, which for me confirms it also. Now, some would question the fact that Moses wrote the book by simply stating, well, Deuteronomy chapter 34 records Moses' death, so how could he have recorded his own demise? Now, that shouldn't be considered a problem because we actually understand, and the traditional view is held and has been held for thousands of years, that Joshua actually scribed the book from Moses' own first-hand account, and that he thereby closed the book by writing the account of Moses' death, doing so shortly after he died. Alongside, actually, we do see various other editorial comments that are recognized by Bible experts as having been added to the book by the scribe, or in this case, Joshua. The other important thing, as I said in the introduction, was to think about who this book was written to. Who were the recipients? Now, the events in this book of Deuteronomy, they're seen to take place on the plain of Moab, due east of Jericho, just across the Jordan River. We are told that in both Deuteronomy 1, verse 1, the very opening verse, and again in 29, verse 1. But it's interesting to note that what's described here cover a period of only about 1 month. We know that from chapter 1, chapter 34, and Joshua, when he's referring to these events in chapter 5, 6, verses 12 of his book, also confirms that. The approaching death of Moses probably provided the initial basis for the renewal of the covenant being revealed again and discussed. Moses' role had been so significant that for many people, Moses and the covenant, in the minds of a section of certainly probably the older people, they almost seemed inseparable. And naturally, some might have thought upon his demise, perhaps this meant the end of this era. Now, the book was likely written at the very end of this 40-year period of wandering in the wilderness described in the previous books of the Pentateuch. So thereby, people who try and date this book would suggest it's written about 1407 BC, before the birth of Christ. So what that means is this book is written to what some have called the second generation, a new generation that, having grown up 40 years after the events described in the Exodus and had seen Moses become an old man, which was there for the reason that this is repeated and explained. The law that was given to the people needed to be re-given, in a sense, to this new generation before they entered the land of Canaan. This new generation needs to be taught, or at least reminded, about God's law before entering the land. This principle of reminding people of important events of the past remains to this day. Events like the Second World War, the Vietnam War, the Holocaust, the lessons learned need to be and are often represented so that those lessons learned and those are not forgotten by a new generation. But what's the message of the book? Well, after receiving the law, originally at Mount Sinai, we know that Israel spent about 40 years in the wilderness region between Sinai and Canaan. The instructions given in this book is that which was recorded in the last weeks of Moses' life, whilst Israel is actually camped on the plain of Moab, preparing to enter in and conquer the land. Again, this has been described from Moses' words by Joshua. But the book of Deuteronomy is much more than just a plain repetition of the law previously given. It is also what we would call today an exposition of what it means. It reinstates the commandments of the law, yes, but with a renewed and some might say more focused practical emphasis. The law, recorded in Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, gives very clear legal requirements. But Deuteronomy does not lessen any of those requirements, but it adds into the mix the insight that Israel's nation must have more than just legal correctness underpinning it. It also must have relational and spiritual tenderness underpinning it, almost a warm affection underpinning the application of this law. The covenant promise is the basis of Deuteronomy, but the relationship between God and his people within that covenant and how that covenant needs to be underpinned and revealed as one that absolutely at its core must hold love. The sovereign love of God towards his people should be seen as that which produces the response of obedience out of love to God, not the blind following of just rules. The previous generation had sworn covenant loyalty to God at Sinai, but still we see, and it has been revealed, that they have failed him badly. But now that this new generation had come along, and that this new generation were about to enter Canaan after 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, the covenant was reminded and renewed here, allowing this generation of people, this new people, to also give that fresh pledge of obedience to God, some might say in a more personal, intimate way. So the structure of the book is actually fairly straightforward in the sense that its literary structure is quite simple. It records what Moses says to the people in the plain of Moab in a series of messages. Deuteronomy's style is that style of a preacher rather than just a cold lawgiver. Its emphasis is that the people should keep God's law because they want to know how to love him better, not merely because they're required to do it by legalistic covenant, but it should arise out of a perspective of love. So a common view of Deuteronomy is that it is simply the recording of a series of sermons. Now, there are different views on the number of sermons contained with it. I'm going with what I believe is the correct and also the most popular view, that there are 3 main sermons in it. The first sermon is the appeal for obedience based out of the events of history I've seen. This first sermon covers chapter 1 verse 1 through to chapter 4 verse 49. The first 3 chapters re-examine the wilderness journey, and then he concludes that chapter, that initial sermon, if you like, with an exhortation, an encouragement to remain obedience. The second sermon, the longest of them, preachers love this one because it gives them license to preach a big sermon, because Moses was seen to be someone who preached a big sermon, because this one goes on for 21 chapters from verses 5 verse 1 to verses 26 verse 19. And the theme of it might be described as the legal basis for obedience. So again, people are reminded from chapters 5 to 11 of the basic commandment, and then he unpacks that in a series of points, much as a preacher today would give a 3-point sermon with the specific legislation itself, examining each part of it one by one. And that is covered from chapters 12 to chapters 26. And in the third sermon, sits more in the tradition of what we would today call a prophetic message, a prophetic exhortation for obedience. And that's the last 4 chapters from 27 verse 1 to 30 verse 20. So the covenant is renewed by command in chapter 27, and then in chapter 28 there's this passage often taught on as a separate section on blessings and cursings, and there is a final concluding charge, if you like, in chapter 29 and 30. Now that's not the close of the book. The transitional details of what will happen following Moses' death are also revealed and discussed in the closing chapter of the book, chapter 31, where we are introduced to Joshua and the law, and then there's this closing exhortation called, in chapter 32, the Song of Moses, and then the blessing of Moses is chapter 33, and then the book closes in chapter 34 with the death of Moses. So that's the structure of the book. That's how the message is given. But any message needs to have a purpose. So what is the purpose of this book? We're going to spend 40 days in it. What does it want us to get out of it? Well, I think clearly, first of all, the purpose of Deuteronomy is for Moses, is fueled out of the desire of Moses to address the children of Israel before he dies, before they enter the land. He himself is not going to enter the land. Joshua will. And he again finally wants to remind the people, urge them to obey the Lord, saying that if they do so, they will indeed be blessed. But if they do not, they will be cursed. And he also needs to, as I said at the end of the book, communicate the transitional arrangements involving Joshua before he died. Otherwise, some might make the mistake of believing that the promise was only for that generation and shouldn't continue. Joshua in this book is going to be seen to be appointed as Moses' successor, both in a public ceremony in Deuteronomy 31 through 34, but also prior to that in a little private tent meeting with Moses himself. The succession of human leadership is not seen to be the result of a power struggle, not even the result of some sort of democratic process. It is seen very much as a matter of divine appointment. And this is a sense in where the church differs slightly from how the world might approach things. Furthermore, instructions are given regarding the authentication of the actual text of the law. General instructions are given for the covenant renewal and the procedure that is to be followed into the distant future. In Exodus and Leviticus, God speaks to Moses, but in Deuteronomy, it's interesting to see that we begin to see God speak directly to the people. So this sits in a series of books, the 5 books of the Pentateuch, in which we see a change, a development, a fulfilling of God's sovereign communication with humanity and the way in which it's changed and developed. In Genesis, we pretty much saw just a sovereign God who does what he wants to do and elects. In Exodus, we saw that God begins this process of redeeming people through the law, thereby bringing them into a more intimate, personal, sort of relationship between him and his people. In Leviticus, we saw the Holy God continue that process by revealing the way God sanctifies his people. And in Numbers, we saw this added dynamic coming in the sense of how a faithful God, as part of that process, must and need discipline his people where it is appropriate. And then finally in Deuteronomy, we see God revealed as the gracious God who reminds and instructs his people over and over again. So in summary, Moses wrote Deuteronomy to remind Israel of what God had already said and done, and encourages them as the new generation to continue to obey God. And then at the close of the book, he will turn over the leadership to Joshua. And in that, God will be seen to bless the obedient and discipline the disobedience. Obedience, therefore, is revealed as the way of continuing in the blessings of God. Welcome to the Bible Project Daily Podcast, and today we begin our journey through the entire book of Deuteronomy. The plan is today to cover the whole of chapter 1, verse 1 to 43, and in doing so consider the incredible faithfulness of God that it reveals. We all know that God is faithful, but I believe that many of you listening to this today might not just fully grasp just how truly profound God's faithfulness really is. The incredible faithfulness is going to be vividly demonstrated for us in this first chapter of the book of Deuteronomy. So what does this chapter reveal about God's faithfulness? What is it that makes it so remarkable? Well, let me suggest that as we start Deuteronomy chapter 1, we're going to embark on a series of studies through the entire book. But before diving into the specifics of chapter 1, I'd like to share a few words about the whole book. I'll explain it in more detail as we progress through, but it's important to note that people over history have taken different approaches to how they understand the book. The traditional approach views Deuteronomy as a series of sermons that Moses delivers to the children of Israel just before his death. Now I'm going to take that perspective, so the first question is, how many sermons does the book contain? Now some do say 5, others suggest 3, with an additional sort of coda provided afterwards. After examining this content in detail myself over these past few weeks, I've finally settled on what I believe is the most effective way to view Deuteronomy, and it is as a series of 3 sermons. Now the sermons are quite lengthy. In fact, one of them stretches over 20 odd verses. But today I'm going to begin by looking not at the sermons but in the introduction. And the first 5 verses of chapter 1 provide what we call an introduction to this chapter. And after these introductory verses, the rest of the chapter is then divided into 2 further sections where Moses recounts, before preaching his sermons, what has happened at Sinai and beyond. So welcome to today's episode of the Bible Project Daily Podcast. Okay, we're going to begin by examining first of all these first 5 verses. In verse 1 it simply says, "These are the words which Moses spoke to all Israel on the side of the Jordan in the wilderness." Now if you drop down to verse 2, you'll notice that it mentions an 11-day journey. To put this into context, you may recall that after Exodus, the Exodus from Egypt, the Israelites travelled to Mount Sinai, and from there they journeyed to a place called Kadesh Barnea. However, as we'll also see in this chapter, they refused to enter the promised land at that time, which led in fact God to discipline them. Because of their disobedience, God allowed an entire generation to die in the wilderness. Now when the second generation comes along, they were finally going to enter the land, but not from the south near Kadesh Barnea, as was originally thought. Instead, they're now approaching from the east side of the Jordan. So before Moses dies, he speaks to the Israelites on the east side of the Jordan, and after his death it will be Joshua who will lead them across the Jordan into the land. Verse 2 mentions that it's going to be an 11-day journey, and this is a significant detail. If you travel directly from Sinai to Kadesh Barnea, which is at the southern end of the Promised Land, it would only take about 11 days, a journey of roughly the equivalent to doing a marathon a day, just over 25 miles a day. But Moses indicates that the entire nation are going to make this trip in just 11 days. That's impressive, isn't it? Verse 3 and 4 gives us the specific time frame that's going to be involved here. Let me just read the next 3 verses. "In the 40th year, on the first day of the 11th month, Moses proclaimed to the Israelites all the Lord had commanded him concerning them. This was after he had defeated Sihon, the king of the Amorites, who reigned in Heshbon, and at Edrei had defeated Og, king of Bashan, who reigned in Ashtaroth. East of the Jordan, in the territory of Moab, Moses began to expound this law, saying." Okay, I'll pause there. This tells us that these events occur 40 years after the Exodus from Egypt. But why 40 years? Well, the answer is from the time they left Egypt until they passed the east side of the Jordan, nearly 40 years have now passed. Whilst the wandering in the wilderness technically only lasted 38 years, the Bible often rounds this figure up to 40 years because it includes the time spent at Sinai and at Kadesh Barnea before their extended wandering. Additionally, it's interesting to note the timing. The 11th month, on the first day of the month, that corresponds roughly to what we would today call the end of January or perhaps the beginning of February. This is the time of year when Moses delivers these speeches we're going to hear. And verse 5 tells us more about his activities at this time. The placing of these activities at this time on this side of the Jordan in the land of Moab, Moab began to explain this saying. And this is the point at which he starts speaking. Now, one of the reasons I believe Deuteronomy is a series of sermons given by Moses is this and other texts. It tells us explicitly that Moses is explaining the law to the people. He wasn't just reciting a treaty, an agreement, a legal code, so to speak. He was teaching on it, clarifying and exhorting, encouraging the people, and explaining what had already been given. Now, some refer to Deuteronomy and call it the second law, a name given to it by the creators of the Septuagint, the first Greek translation out of the Hebrew, because it repeats much of the law given in Exodus and the other books of the Pentateuch. However, Moses' primary purpose was to encourage the Israelites to obey these laws that he's describing again for them. The Hebrew word used here for proclaiming the law is rich in nuanced meaning. It means more than just to read it out. It means to make it clear and to declare it by making it clear. And this is exactly what I believe every preacher should strive to do, every pastor should strive to do. It is to explain and clarify the scriptures. That's what true proclamation is, so that the people listening are able to understand them and, more importantly, apply them. Now, when we hear the word law as it's translated in English, it often has this restrictive negative connotation around it, something that is difficult to keep, something which has consequences if we fail. And yes, that may be true, but the Hebrew word for law actually is wider than that because it also includes the element of instruction. I'm not saying law is a bad translation, but instruction might capture the idea better. The law was God's instruction to Israel on how to live under this covenant promise he had made with Abraham. So in these first 5 verses, we see the location, the time, and the activity of Moses on the east side of the Jordan before they enter the promised land. And this provides the geographical as well as the chronological context and settings for the sermons to follow. But before we dive into the message of this chapter 1, I want to make just one more observation. The passage we're going to read is filled with details, dates, and locations that might seem irrelevant to us today. However, these details are crucial because the places and the events are placed within a specific historical framework. This tells us and reminds us that this isn't just a story. It's not a fairy tale that's coming. These are historical events that happened in real time and in real places. The accuracy and attention to detail is there as a way to try and affirm to us, to help us recognize that we're dealing with historical facts. It's not just ancient history. It's not just fiction or fantasy. It's talking about real-time, real-world events. So with this short introduction, let's now look at the 2 main sections of this chapter, starting with what happens in Sinai, and we begin with verse 6. The Lord our God said to us at Horeb, "You have stayed long enough at this mountain. Break camp and advance into the hill country of the Amorites, and go to all the neighboring people in Arabah, in the mountains in the western foothills, in the Negev, and along the coast to the land of the Canaanites, and to Lebanon, as far as the great river, the Euphrates. See, I have given you this land. Go in and take possession of the land the Lord swore he would give to your fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and to their descendants after them. At that time I said to you, you are too heavy a burden for me to carry alone. The Lord our God has increased your numbers so that today you are as numerous as the stars in the sky. The Lord our God spoke to us at Horeb, saying, you have dwelt long enough at this mountain. Now, this isn't just an empty statement. Remember that God has promised that the descendants of Israel would be as numerous as the stars in the sky, and that promise has been delivered. In these verses, it says the Lord and God has increased your numbers so that today you're as numerous as the stars in the sky. Too numerous as the stars in the skies? Well, according to Numbers 26, the census we see reported there were about 600,000 men in the nation of Israel now, not even including women and children. So when God says they are numerous as the stars in the skies, then clearly these numbers demonstrate the acknowledgement of the fulfillment of his promise. God's point now is that the nation has grown too large for just one man, Moses in this case, to govern efficiency. And in those verses in Numbers, we see Moses lamenting of the fact that and questioning God about how can he possibly bear all the problems and the burdens and all the disputes among the people by himself. And God's solution at that time was for him to appoint what were called judges. He instructed the Israelites to choose wise and knowledgeable men from among the tribes, and Moses would make these people sort of deputized leaders over the people. This was when God appointed judges to assist Moses. Anyway, picking up the text in verse 13, it says, God chose some wise, understanding, and respected men from each of the tribes I will set over you. So Moses here is summarizing the events that took place in the earlier books of the Pentateuch, continuing verse 14. You answered me, what you propose to do is good. So I took the leading men of your tribes, wise and respected men, and appointed them to have authority over you as commanders of thousands, of hundreds, and of fifties, and of tens, and as tribal officials. And I charged your judges at that time, hear the disputes between your people, and judge fairly, whether the case is between two Israelites or between an Israelite and a foreigner residing among you. Do not show partiality in judging. Hear both small and great alike. Do not be afraid of anyone, for judgment belongs to God. Bring any case too hard for you, and I will hear it. And at that time I told you everything you were to do. So, like I said, the story that's being related here is one where the nation has grown too large for Moses to handle, and certainly not handle the disputes that arise between people. So God directs him to establish a sort of organized system of government. This is the first introduction into human history of the idea of governance and government. It also includes the aspect of military leaders, officials, public officials, and people with the role of what are described as judges. The idea is to create a structure where leadership would be distributed among a large group of people, making it possible for those people to be governed effectively. And notice how Moses organizes the people. He chooses the leaders who are recognized as being wise and knowledgeable, and he creates a hierarchical structure. There were leaders over groups of thousands, then under them leaders over groups of hundreds, then again under them people who had responsibility over 50s, and finally even leaders over small groups of around 10 people. So this is an elaborate organization, isn't it? But clearly it's necessary when a nation has grown to its size. Each leader could handle the need of the small group that they directly reported to. And if the problem was too complex, it could be escalated up the chain. So the system was designed so that disputes and all areas could be managed effectively. And that Moses himself, of course, wouldn't be overwhelmed by the caseload of problems that continually appeared at his feet. And like Moses today, I would suggest church leaders need to understand that this passage is essential to telling us that we all need to delegate. We need others to help, to step up, to help carry the load, just as we see here and as we see the early church do in Acts chapter 6, when the apostles decided to appoint deacons to manage the daily distribution of food in the issue that they were dealing with, widows and orphans, and they appointed these people in order that they could continue to focus on the main focus of prayer and the ministry of the word among the people. So the Bible does recognize the need for organization among the people of God. In Deuteronomy, we see Moses here setting up, or we're told again about Moses setting up this elaborate system of judgments, and part of it is to deal with disputes among the people. They were there to help Moses and to help Moses revolve situations because he can't handle everything himself. The load must always be distributed among capable people. But there's a reminder here given also that how these people should operate, with two primary instructions given. Firstly, not to show partiality, and secondly, to judge fairly, righteously as it's described. He emphasizes also that they shouldn't be afraid of anyone, because ultimately judgment will belong to God. And if a case is too difficult, it could be passed up the line, even eventually and potentially brought before Moses. But the general expectation is that the judges would handle nearly all of the disputes and do so justly and fairly. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this chapter has two main sections: the events at Sinai and the events at Kadesh Barnea. The first part of this chapter, in which we've discussed, has dealt with what happened at Sinai, and this is the point where the nation got organized. The organization is essential because the population has grown to such an extent. But now let's pick up and see where it's going from verses 19. I'll read to you 19 to 21. Then, as our Lord God commanded us, we set out from Horeb and went towards the hill country of the Ammonites, through all that vast and dreadful wilderness, so that you have seen, and so that we had reached Kadesh Barnea. Then I said to you, and this is the Lord reminding Moses what he had said and done. He said, you have reached the hill country of the Amorites, which the Lord our God is giving us. See, the Lord your God has given you the land. Go up and take possession of it, as the Lord God of your ancestors told you. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged. So when they reach Kadesh Barnea, the people come to Moses with a suggestion, and that's recorded now in verse 22. Then all of you came to me and said, let us send men ahead to spy out the land for us and bring back a report about the route we are to take and the towns we will come to. So in other words, the children of Israel are the ones themselves who suggested sending spies into the land first. So notice this idea originated from the people. It didn't actually come from God. However, in verse 23, we see Moses recall, the idea seemed good to me, so I selected 12 of you, one man from each tribe. They left and went up into the hill country and came to the valley of Eshcol and explored it. Now remember, he's recounting here events that have happened, but he's recounting them to this new generation, the original generations who've died out. And apart from it being passed on to some by word of mouth, he's reminding everybody of the whole history, their whole story up to this point. And he's pointing out here, and we need to know, that it was the people who proposed this strategy. Moses approved of it, definitely, and he selected 12 men, one from each tribe, to carry out this spy mission. Interestingly, the Lord also did, it seem, approve this plan. We learned that when we looked at Numbers chapter 13, the opening verses of that. So I'm not saying it wasn't necessarily a bad idea. After all, anyone, if they're going to enter a hostile territory, it makes sense to gather intelligence about that situation before you go in. The plan had the potential to be helpful, but it also had the potential to go awry, which is exactly what we see happened. Verse 25 recounts what happens next when it tells us, taking with them some of the fruit of the land, they brought it down and reported, it is a good land that the Lord our God is given us. So the initial first part of the report was positive. The spies explored the land and brought back some of its fruit to the people, which they said was remarkably good. Now the valley of Eshcol, near Hebron, is still actually recognized today as a place that has good soil. It is well known for growing of grapes there to this day. But in this situation, we see the spies simply confirming to the people that the land, from an agricultural point of view, was good, just as the Lord had promised. But then comes verse 26. But you were unwilling to go up, and you rebelled against the command of the Lord your God. You grumbled in your tents and said, the Lord hates us, so he brought us out of Egypt to deliver us into the hands of the Amorites and to destroy us. So instead of receiving this initial report positively and moving forward in faith, we actually see the people rebel. They allow their fear to take hold, leading them actually to accuse God of not having their best intentions at heart, hating them, even intending to destroy them. So notice what's happening here. They're not actually taking responsibility for their own rebellion. They're not accepting that where they're coming from is basically a position of lack of faith. Instead, they're blaming God. Now, this blame shifting is as old as Adam himself. It's revealed to us right back in the beginning of Genesis. It's in our human nature. If we remember that, we remember how Adam responded after eating the forbidden fruit. He said, it was the woman that you gave me, and she led me to the tree, and I ate. So he blames not only Eve, but he actually blames God for giving him Eve for the situation and the actions that he chose. And similarly here later, the Israelites are now blaming God for their fear and rebellion, claiming that he brought them out of Egypt, in fact, to destroy them. So they've got a twisted view of God, which is a direct result. It rises out of their defiance, their fear, their cowardice, and their sin. And I think the warning here is that when we disobey God, when we defy God, it can lead us to a state that rather than look at ourselves, it corrupts our perception of God and his motivation towards us. Verse 28 goes on to reveal more of their mindsets. Where can we go, the people said. Our brothers have made our hearts melt in fear. They said the people there are stronger and taller than we. Their cities are large and they're walled up to the sky. We even saw Anakites there. Now the people's hearts are clearly discouraged by this additional report that's been brought to them by the spies. The spies described the land as actually containing 4 to 5 cities with the walls as high as the heavens, using hyperbole there, and they even continue this exaggerated vein when they describe the land as being full of giants. The most terrifying aspect of the report was probably the mention of this Anakim race, who were believed to be a race of giants. The Israelites were overwhelmed by the thoughts of facing such formidable opponents. But rather than trusting in God, who had remembered promised to deliver this very land into their hands, they chose to believe the 10 spies who returned with this report with effectively claims that conquering this land would be impossible. Now remember, these spies were considered the experts because they were the ones who'd gone in and seen the land firsthand. Yet their report was able to shake the faith of the entire nation. So despite God's clear and consistent care and provision and its promise, they decided to go with the report of men. Now, it's easy just to sneer at the stubbornness of the Israelites in this situation, but let's not be too quick to judge. This kind of doubt and fear isn't unique to the Israelites. It's our common human experience, and fear, even today, is the main thing that drives people out of following the plan of God in their life. This episode, for me, reminds us that defiance and fear can lead us to doubt not only God's motivation, but God's promises, no matter how clear his guidance has been in the past. The Israelites' refusal to enter the promised land was rooted ultimately in their unwillingness to trust God and to place that trust over and above their human fears. And as we shall see, the consequences of this refusal, this rebellion, are going to be severe. Verse 29 then continues with Moses attempting to encourage the Israelites. Then I said to you, he says, so he's talking about what he said to the people then, do not be terrified, do not be afraid of them. The Lord your God, who is going before you, will fight for you, as he did for you in Egypt, before your very eyes, and in the wilderness. There you saw how the Lord your God carried you, as a father carries his son, all the way you went until you reached this place. So Moses reminds them that God has already proven to them his faithfulness. He provided water from a rock, no less. He protected them from danger. He even guided them with the physical presence of a cloud by day and a fire by night. Yet despite all these miraculous acts, the people, when they reached Kadesh Barnea, they chose to believe the fearful reports of the spies rather than trust in the sovereignty of God, which they'd witnessed over and over again. So Moses is laying out the facts here. He's not rebuking them without evidence. He's laying out the facts and he's lamenting it as he does it. Verses 32 and 33 tell us, in spite of this, you did not trust the Lord who went ahead of you on the journey. And as I said, fire by night, cloud by day. He went to search out places before you, a place for you to camp and to show you the way to go. So after all of this and everything they've witnessed, their hearts still lacked the faith to step forward in the plan of God. And God's response to their unbelief is now recounted again to the people as being swift and severe. And in verse 34 onwards, Moses says this: When the Lord heard what you said, he was angry, and he solemnly swore, no one from this evil generation shall see this good land I swore to give your ancestors, except Caleb, the son of Jephunneh. He will see it, and I will give him and his descendants the land he set his feet on, because he followed the Lord wholeheartedly. Now, Joshua is included in this. We know this from other parts of the account, but we also find out that here now that Caleb and Joshua are going to be the exceptions. And they're going to be the exceptions because they fully followed the Lord despite the majority in fear and the rebellion of the people. They argued and represented the idea that the people should continue on and should go into the land. And then Moses adds a personal note in verse 37 when he says, because of you the Lord became angry with me also, and said, you shall not enter in either. So Moses is probably talking here about the fact, yes, the people who he had led had made this decision, but also Moses himself had been disobedient in striking the rock instead of speaking to the rock when they needed water. God had said he would deliver the water when the people needed it, but Moses, instead of relying on that promise, had appeared to make the water flow from the rock in a way that it would appear to the people that he was the one who initiated that. And because of that and these other factors, God decreed that he too would not actually enter the promised land. And that's a powerful reminder, isn't it, to leadership, that we are not immune to God's discipline. It even fell on someone as great as Moses. And then in verse 38, it records Moses being honest with the people about this, but telling them about Joshua, saying that even though he's going to be excluded, it says, but your assistant Joshua, son of Nun, he will enter it. Encourage him, because he will lead Israel to inherit the land. So now we see, as I said, Joshua alongside Caleb. The ones who did not align with the majority negative report would be the ones who would lead this next generation into the land. And then in verses 39 to 40, God offers that glimmer of hope to the people. And the little ones that you said would be taken captive, your children who did not yet know good from bad, they are the one who will enter the land. I will give it to them, and they will take possession of it. But as for you, turn around and set towards the desert along the route to the Red Sea. So God promises that now that it will be the children of this original generation who were considered too young to know good from evil, they're going to be the one who inherit the land. Now, this passage has often been cited as the basis for the concept of living within an age of accountability, the idea that God does not hold individuals accountable for sin until they reach an age of moral understanding and in free will make choices that mean they either follow the will of the God or the will of the world. Anyway, the story itself that we're looking at today in this chapter doesn't end there. In verse 41, we see the people attempt to rectify their rebellion. They confess their sin, and we hear them declare it and say, "We have sinned against the Lord. We will go up and fight as the Lord has commanded us. So every one of you put on his weapons, thinking it is easy to go up into the hill country." Now, this decision was made out of the presumption rather than faith. Moses warns them in verse 22, "The Lord has said to me, tell them, do not go up and fight, because if they do, I will not be with you. You will be defeated by your enemies." But this original generation of people are still at this point acting in defiance. So having procrastinated for 40 years or thereabouts, they're now ignoring the warnings and saying, "We can do this on our own." And then verse 43 recounts the result of that tragic result. "So I told you," it says, "but you would not listen. You rebelled against the Lord's commands in your arrogance, and you marched up into the hill country." Without God's presence, their efforts were doomed to fail. And in verse 44, we see the consequences. "The Amorites who lived in those hills came out against you, and they chased you like a swarm of bees, and beat you down from Seir all the way to Homa." So the people, this original generation, were defeated because they attempted to do what they could have done as a gift, but they then later attempted to do it under their own strength. They attempted to do something they could only accomplish if God was with him. And the last two verses of this opening chapter drive this point home. "You came back and wept before the Lord, but he paid no attention to your weeping and turned a deaf ear to you. And so you stayed in Kadesh these many days." So their disobedience, as revealed in this recap and retelling of the story of the first generation, show the door closed into the promised land for that whole generation. And as a result, they remain at Kadesh for what is described many days. So this whole chapter, this whole passage is meant to be a sobering reminder of the consequences of rebellion and the importance of trusting in God's promises. When we act out of fear or the presumption that we can do things on our own, rather than in the faith of the Lord, who is himself will be the one who will deliver us, when we step out of alignment, out of God's will, the results can and often will be absolutely disastrous. The Israelites' experience documented here is meant to serve as a warning to us all to trust in the Lord, even when the circumstances seem daunting, even obey his commandments when we don't know how things will work out, and not to try and step out and do things in our own strength. So let's bring this passage, this opening chapter, to a close by reflecting on the lessons I believe it reveals to us. Remember, this passage from Deuteronomy isn't just an ancient story. It's meant to be a profound, important illustration of God's unwavering faithfulness, even in the face of human failure. The Israelites are seen to repeatedly fall short throughout this narrative, not only described again here, but revealed across Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers in the Pentateuch story. It shows how they rebelled, it shows how they complained, and it shows how they doubted God's promises again and again. Yet despite their unfaithfulness, God always remains true to his word. God had promised the land to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We saw that, and God was determined to fulfill that promise. When the first generation refused to trust him and didn't enter the promised land, God didn't abandon his overall covenant promise. Instead, he ensured that that promise would be carried over to the next generation, to those who hadn't reached the age of accountability in the land at that time, and those who would be born later. This is the generation who would inherit the land. This is a clear testament to God's faithfulness, showing that his promises will stand firm regardless of our human frailty. Moses here is repeating this whole story to the people to remind them of their history, but also to emphasize God's faithfulness to future generations today, which include, of course, us today, we are potential inheritors of this promise from a spiritual perspective. This account wasn't just a history lesson for the Israelites. It's meant to be a timeless reminder down through the ages that God is reliable, trustworthy, and steadfast, and his will not be scuppered by our individual attempts to do things in our own ways, whether singly or collectively. The overarching truth revealed here is that God is always faithful to his children, even when they're not faithful to him. The big picture is revealed here. The Israelites, or this generation of Israelites, despite their lack of faith and repeated failures, were still provided for and protected during this 40 years in the wilderness. This incredible faithfulness of God was evidenced by, do you remember, his daily provision of manna and of quail, his provision of water when they needed this, his guidance through the wilderness, in order that he could ultimately fulfill his promise. But it wasn't going to be through that generation. It was going to be through the following one. But if we carry this idea a step further, we can see it carried forward into the New Testament, where this theme of the faithfulness of God is echoed repeatedly. For example, in 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, verse 3, Paul writes, "But the Lord is faithful, who will establish you and guard you from the evil one." So this verse, among many others, highlights that God's faithfulness isn't just about fulfilling the promises from the past, but it's about establishing you in the faith today and protecting you and guarding us all in the presence. Consider also 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 13, where it says, "No temptation has overtaken you except such as is common to man. But God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able, but with the temptation you will still make the way of escape, yet you may be able to bear it." So here again we see God's faithfulness in action. His promise is he not only will protect us, but when we face sin, he will protect us and not allow us to suffer anything that might cause us to be overwhelmed. He always provides us with the strength and means to overcome the trials we face if we just hold fast to him. Hebrews 10:23 encourages us to do exactly that. It says, "Hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering, for he who promised it is faithful." So this verse again reassures us that God is faithful and he will reward those who remain steadfast in the faith with him. And finally, from a New Testament perspective, 1 John chapter 1 verse 9 reminds us of the incredible mercy that flows from God's faithfulness. It says, "If we confess our sins, he is always faithful and just to forgive us our sins and to cleanse us from all unrighteousness." So even when we fall short, God's faithfulness ensures us that we can always be forgiven and restored. And let's not forget 2 Timothy chapter 2:13, which sums up this whole theme for us, I think, beautifully, where it says, "If we are faithless, he remains faithful, because he cannot deny himself." So even when we falter in our faith, the New Testament reveals that God's nature is to remain a faithful God. That is unchanged. He can never deny who he is. His faithfulness is intrinsic to his character, so we can rely on that, no matter our own personal or moral failings, providing we return in him and have faith in trust in his salvation plan for us. So in conclusion, the message from Deuteronomy, revealed here in this opening chapter, but I hope you'll understand and see too in the New Testament, across the New Testament, is clear, and that is that God is faithful even when you are not. He will protect you, he will provide for you, he will provide for him and his children through all circumstances. And our response, all we're called to do, is respond in trust and faithfulness to this faithful character of God revealed here, to rely on him, to rely on his promises and hold fast to our faith, knowing that ultimately he will never let you down. So go forward into this coming day, this coming week, this coming year with confidence in the steadfast love and faithfulness of God. A God who never wavered, a God who never fails, and a God who always fulfills and keeps his word. And thanks be to him for that. Thanks for being with me today. Okay, that was a big one today, so I'll close out very quickly and remind you that you can follow this podcast for free by subscribing wherever you get your podcasts from. And that way you'll have made a decision to make the study of the Word of God part of your daily life. You can also reach out and connect to me in the various places through where the Buzzsprout is hosted on buzzsprout.com. But those messages are encrypted there, so although I can answer them, we can't have a personal conversation. Or I could recommend that you become part of our Patreon community. It's a place where those who want to partner and be more intimately involved, not only with this ministry, but in the whole wider aspects of the Christian journey that I am making in life, in the other areas I'm studying, like the Church History podcast, and in my teaching and studying of areas where Christianity intersects with modern ideologies, philosophy, psychology, even science and the arts, things like that. All that bonus material is over there on Patreon. Now you can follow me for free, and by doing that you'll have access to an early ad-free version of every podcast, but there are also tiers there where I make available some bonus episodes for those few people who feel that God's called them to partner with me in this ministry, thereby making all my main podcast and Bible study material available free on all these podcast platforms all around the world. So thanks to all of you, whether you're listening on your own podcast provider, whether you're on Patreon, wherever you are. All these podcast platforms, all the main ones, and YouTube as well. Thanks to all of you for being with me today, and I do trust I'll see you back here again tomorrow as we continue our journey through the Bible on the Bible Project Daily Podcast. Bye-bye for now.